On a cold morning in the autumn of 1942, Viktor Frankl arrived at Auschwitz. He was 37 years old. He was a psychiatrist with an already distinguished career and a manuscript, his first major work on logotherapy, sewn into the lining of his coat. The manuscript was taken from him at the gate. His wife, his parents, and his brother would die in the camps. He himself would pass through Auschwitz, Kaufering, and Turkheim before liberation in April 1945. But even in those conditions, perhaps especially in those conditions, he never stopped observing. Not because he was cold or dissociated, but because he understood, with the precision of a scientist and the urgency of a man fighting for his own survival, that what was happening around him was revealing something essential about the human condition. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl divided the psychological experience of the concentration camp prisoner into 3 phases. The first was the phase of shock and terror immediately following arrival. The second was the phase of relative apathy, a merciful emotional numbness that settled in as the initial horror became the new normal. The third, for those who survived long enough to experience it, was the phase of liberation and its aftermath, a phase marked not by immediate joy but by a strange psychological dislocation, as men who had trained themselves to feel nothing tried to learn how to feel again. Within these phases, Frankl observed patterns that no clinical setting could have generated. He saw the direct relationship between meaning and survival, not as an abstract correlation but as a visceral, observable reality. Men who had a why, a person waiting for them, a work to complete, a testimony to bear, endured conditions that broke men who had no such orientation. He saw this not once but repeatedly, in case after case, in himself and in those around him. He also observed the collapse of ordinary moral structures under extreme conditions, and the preservation of extraordinary moral structures in individuals who had found something to hold on to. He documented acts of breathtaking generosity among people who had nothing, a man giving his last crust of bread to a weaker prisoner, a woman spending her final conscious hours comforting others. These acts were irrational from the standpoint of survival. They were intelligible only as expressions of value, of a decision, however unconscious, about who one intended to be regardless of circumstances. One of the most striking observations Frankl made was about the role of the future. Prisoners who had lost their orientation toward the future deteriorated rapidly. The man who could not imagine anything worth surviving for, who had surrendered the future to despair, typically died within days or weeks of making that inner surrender. It was as if the biological will to survive required some attachment to a meaningful future in order to function. Without it, the organism gave up. Frankl observed this pattern with such consistency that he came to believe it was one of the primary psychological laws governing survival under extremity. He also observed something that disturbed him deeply. The capacity for cruelty was not the exclusive property of any one group or type. Among the capos, the prisoners appointed to supervise other prisoners, he saw behavior as brutal as anything perpetrated by the guards. Power, in the absence of meaning, produced its own pathology. And among the guards, he occasionally encountered acts of unexpected humanity, a guard who slipped a prisoner extra food, a commandant who could be negotiated with, that reminded him that the line between good and evil ran not between groups but through the interior of every human being. This is perhaps the most unsettling and important thing Frankl took from the camps, that the human being contains, simultaneously, the capacity for the most heroic self-transcendence and the most horrifying self-betrayal. The conditions did not create these capacities. They revealed them. Auschwitz was a laboratory not because it manufactured human qualities but because it stripped away everything that ordinarily concealed them, leaving the core of the person, their values, their choices, their inner freedom, exposed. For the rest of his life, Frankl was asked how he maintained his humanity in such conditions. His answer was always the same. He did not, could not, guarantee that he had. He was capable of cruelty under pressure. He had moments of despair, of selfishness, of nearly losing himself entirely. What saved him, he believed, was not extraordinary virtue but extraordinary orientation. The image of his wife's face, the unfinished manuscript he intended to reconstruct, the conviction that what he was living through had something to teach the world. The laboratory of the soul had not made him a saint. It had made him a witness. And it is the testimony of that witness that, 80 years later, still has the power to change lives. Frankl's contribution from the concentration camp laboratory was not just theoretical. He brought back something practical, the knowledge that human beings are more than their conditions, that the interior life can sustain itself in the most adverse external circumstances, and that meaning is not a reward for favorable situations but a possibility always available to the person willing to look for it. This knowledge, paid for at an incomprehensible price, is the inheritance he left for anyone willing to receive it. The camps tested the human being at the absolute limit. What Frankl reported back from that limit, that something essential survived, that freedom persisted, that meaning was findable even there, is the most important psychological testimony of the modern era. Subscribe to The Psychology of Viktor Frankl to explore more of his timeless ideas.